What's up you guys, Sasha here. Now just a few hours ago, late last night, Rishi Sunak announced there's going to be yet another new furlough scheme, which is now going to replace the 1-month extension that they announced just a few days ago that was there to replace the job support scheme, that was there to replace the outgoing furlough scheme. It's getting a little bit too complicated. I'm going to tell you in this video exactly what this new scheme is, exactly who it may help. I'm going to tell you some opinions about why it took them so long to actually come out with this scheme. Why did it take them until now to go and actually announce something like this? And why is this scheme suddenly more generous than all of the schemes that they've recently been announcing? Now, with the US election happening and all the other news that is going on, it is actually quite difficult to go and find any news about this. You have to look quite far down on specific parts of the BBC website to actually find any mention of this announcement that only happened a few hours ago. But anyway, from the beginning of November, employers, according to the scheme, will be able to pay furloughed staff up to 80% of their wages through the government support. So they won't have to pay any of that. The employees on this scheme will be able to take a 20% cut so that the employer doesn't have to pay anything other than pension contributions and national insurance contributions. This is exactly the same as it was in August. Some of the people are reporting that it's the same as it was in May. That's not correct. At the beginning of the scheme, the national insurance contributions and the pension contributions were also covered by the government. In this one, they are not. So it's exactly the same as it was in August. Let me just super quickly fill you in on the timeline, because it can be super confusing with the government seemingly changing this every single week. So this is what happened. At the beginning, the furlough scheme was announced some point in mid to late March, and it started from the beginning of March, and employers were able to put staff on furlough and pay them up to 80% of their wages, and the staff would take a 20% cut in some cases, well, in most cases, as far as I understand it. Then the government would also pay for the minimum legally allowed pension contributions and the national insurance contributions. So this means that in March, employers could take a 20% cut to their employees' salaries, not have to pay anything, and the government would cover the bill. That scheme lasted until the end of July. In August, the scheme didn't seem to change very much. The government was still paying up to 80% of people's salaries, but employers would now have to pay the national insurance contributions of 13.8% and the minimum pension contributions. So roughly speaking, about 3% of salary on that as well. So suddenly, instead of paying zero, they had to pay as much as about 17% of the total salaries of their staff. Now, when you move through September and October, what the government did there is they reduced their contribution from 80% to 70% to 60%, and the employer began having to actually pay a part of the salary. So in September, they had to pay 10% to make it up to the total of 80, and in October, they had to pay 20%. So that means that in October, the government was paying 60% of people's salaries, the employer was paying 20% plus pension and national insurance contributions for a total of about 37% of the salaries. So here is the mess that happened over the last few weeks. On the 24th of September, the government announced the job support scheme. This was meant to replace the job retention scheme that was going to end at the end of October and offer employers some sort of way of paying their employees if they had to shut down according to the government's 3-tier system because their business premises were forced to close. Now, of course, that was not particularly helpful because any business that wasn't legally obliged to close or was, say, in a tier 1 or a tier 2 environment, they stood to benefit in no way whatsoever from the scheme, so that was revised. That was revised on the 22nd of October. Rishi Sunak came out and he said that there's going to be some changes to the scheme, and the changes that I saw that nobody seemed to really talk about were the fact that the scheme would now help businesses that didn't have to legally be closed by the government's tier systems, and that was a huge change because it looked a lot more like the job retention scheme that the government was already running and a lot less like something that would probably not help very many people. Under that scheme, the government would pay something like 67% of people's wages. The employees would actually take a further pay cut to be on the scheme, down from 20% pay cut to 33% pay cut, which is quite substantial, and the employer would still have to pay 17%, so the national insurance contributions and the pension contributions. The reason it was announced on the 22nd of October, which was a Thursday, because that happened to be one day before the 1-week deadline before the end of the month, which is when loads of people who either had less than 2 years tenure in their job or people on sort of short-term, fixed-term contracts would have been made redundant if that announcement didn't come, because they all had 1 week's notice in their jobs. Now, what happened afterwards was, in the last week of October, there was a lot of people being made redundant. There is no data at the moment about this. There's lots of anecdotal evidence. You'll see it in comments. You'll see it in comments on my videos. You'll see it in lots of different places where people say, hey, I lost my job. My husband lost my job. People I know lost their jobs. There's no UK government stats yet. Data from ONS for August shows a rise of just 0.7%, from 3.8% unemployment at the beginning of the year to 4.5% unemployment at the point at which it was measured in August. At the end of October, the government, together with Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, and others, reiterated very strongly the scheme would definitely not get extended. They said that the scheme would definitely end at the end of October. There was no reason for the scheme to be extended further. They said that this new job support scheme was going to be there to replace it, and that message was really rammed home for about a week. Essentially, the point they were trying to make at this point was that businesses who had employees that weren't viable, businesses that had employees that weren't actually able to return to work or make any revenue for the companies, they're basically telling businesses that the support lifeline is finishing and you have to make hard choices. So essentially they forced the hand of a bunch of businesses to let go of people at that point in time. But then the 31st of October happened. Just a few days ago, the retention scheme was extended for 1 month. So they went back on their word and said, okay, we are going to extend the retention scheme by 1 month. That announcement came in at exactly the same time as the lockdown was announced, that started yesterday on the 5th of November. So the reason they put that in place is to try to stem the tide of people criticizing the scheme, people saying that they're unable to work because of the lockdown. They were trying to sort of bridge the gap and make people feel a little bit less uncertain and a little bit less concerned about what this lockdown is going to bring for their employment. So very late yesterday, the Chancellor announced that they are now actually extending the scheme not just by 1 month to the end of November, beginning of December, but now they're going to extend it for 5 months all the way through to March. And that took a lot of people by surprise. Why would you go and extend that scheme for 5 months, and why do it now, and why do it on the terms that they're currently doing? Well, let me tell you my thoughts on this. Let me tell you what I think they're doing it. First, why are they doing it? Now, the government has repeatedly said that they are unable to go and save every job in the country. And you can understand that. It is impossible for the government to go and pay for 9 million people, that was roughly the number of people on furlough at the beginning of the scheme, for a long period of time, because the finances just don't stack up. It's impossible. So what they did, from my personal opinion, is throughout October, they put the fear into businesses that weren't viable, that had employees that weren't viable, or departments that weren't viable. They put the fear into them by saying, hey, this scheme that is currently paying for the bulk of the costs that you are running is going to end. It's going to end at the end of October, and you will have to do something about it. You aren't going to continue being able to get all this free money, so you're going to have to go and make some hard choices. So what people did is people did go and make hard choices. The number of people who are on furlough at the end of October dropped to less than 40% of its peak in April and May. So in essence, what the government is doing is they're saying, okay, well, those jobs that are viable, that have survived through this tough period and through the point when businesses had to make those hard choices, are now going to get the next level of support that they need. The one caveat that I think is really important is that the criteria for deciding who is and isn't eligible for all of these different schemes seems to be remaining the same. It is still linked to businesses as they were before the whole pandemic started. So that means any new businesses, any people who tried to start up a new company while they were on furlough or when they lost their job or anything like that, none of those businesses are eligible. So that means that the government is restricting the entry because businesses that are qualifying for this had to be operational and pay their staff salaries back in February 2020. Now, this scheme is actually incredibly generous. Employees get up to 80% of their salary paid for by the government. If they're on a part-time deal, there's part-time versions of that available as well. And people who are self-employed have also been given a very similar 3-month extension on their self-employed income. So all of this is actually probably pretty much as generous as possible. What the government is trying to do here is to ensure that there isn't as much freeloading potentially from some companies as there was at the beginning. And I don't mean freeloading in the bad kind of way that all businesses are bad and everyone who's taking furlough is bad. What I mean is they're trying to say that businesses should only retain people if they're happy to pay them something. So they're saying as long as the businesses are happy to pay them the pension contributions and national insurance contributions, so at least some money going out every single month, then they are happy for those businesses to retain their employees. The businesses that weren't able to make any repayments up to the end of July, that was actually something that was feasible. They're saying those businesses shouldn't continue using the scheme, which I think is relatively kind of common sense. It makes a lot of sense to have that policy. Now, one really important impact that I haven't heard others mention is the fact that in April, the loans that the government was dishing out to businesses through the business interruption loan scheme, the bounce back loan scheme, and the various other loan schemes that have been about for different sized businesses, those loans, the repayments on them for a lot of businesses start from April. So some companies applied later, or the applications actually took some time. So from April, some businesses will start repaying, and by June, July, the majority of businesses that went through one of these loan schemes are going to have their repayments start. And this is where the problem is. If this job retention scheme actually ties businesses over until March, and then in April, those businesses have to start paying salaries to their employees. At exactly the same time, they'll then have to start making repayments on these loans. And although the loans are being extended, the combination of those two things can be pretty drastic. Now, a few weeks ago, the government did change the rules on the loans. The maximum term when people took them out was 6 years. They've now said that businesses are able to extend those for up to 10 years, and the payments per month would actually almost halve. But here's the thing. My sources tell me that the banks haven't actually had any formal government guidance on that 10-year extension. That was just a public announcement, and that hasn't actually gone through into anything material. So what this means is, in my opinion, they're still deliberating as to exactly what to do with these loans. So rather than forcing the banks to go through one set of changes, like extend them for 10 years and keep the repayment terms and the start date exactly the same, I have this feeling that they're keeping it on tenterhooks because they're still trying to determine if they're going to push the repayment period back. If they're going to give businesses another, say, year without having to pay any interest on the loans, or some other version of that. I do reckon, because they haven't actually gone back to the banks and given them specific instructions as to what to do with the 10-year extension, that there's going to be further changes before those repayments start, especially given that this new furlough scheme now runs right up to the point when the repayments on these loans have to be made. The good news is this will help a huge number of businesses during the lockdown, whether it lasts a month or several months. This furlough scheme is going to be a lifesaver for lots of jobs. So I fully applaud the fact that the government is doing it. The question is, does it also mean then that they are already putting things in place for extending the lockdown beyond the 1 month? I don't know, but with Gove coming out and saying that it's a likelihood, with them putting the scheme in place to end 4 months after the lockdown is currently scheduled to end, it certainly looks like they're considering their options. I don't know, if you have any opinion on this, make sure you leave a comment below. I'd love to read it. If you enjoyed this video, please go and smash that like button for the YouTube algorithm. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching. If you're interested in more videos and updates and content about personal finance, making money online and making more of the money that you have, make sure you subscribe to this channel, hit the bell to get notifications every single time one of my videos comes out. Again, thank you so much for watching if you got this far. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you guys later.